This week on Dialogue, a review of elections in Russia and Iran. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guest for this segment is Blair Ruble. Blair is director of the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies at the Wilson Center, where he also serves as director of Comparative Urban Studies. Blair, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
When I was sitting down to do a little research for our conversation on the Russian elections, the first headline that I came across was "Teary-eyed Putin proclaims victory." And I have to wonder what you were thinking when you saw Mr. Putin stand there and summon up some tears.
Well, he later, I guess, said it was the wind. On the wind, yeah.
Too tough for tears. Huh?
But I actually think it was an important moment, because I think for him, this election was as much about some kind of personal redemption or personal point scoring as it was about policy. The fact that he was coming back, he had told the country he was going to be president, and indeed he was going to be president. I think really the election wasn't so much about policy as it was about his personal ability to quote-unquote control the country.
His Sally Field moment, they love me, or something
That's
like
right.
that.
That's
but,
right.
But you know, the questions that have arisen about the legitimacy of the election, charges of ballot box stuffing and all types of irregularities. What does this indicate? Does Putin believe it was a legitimate victory?
I don't know what's in Vladimir Putin's head. I think.
Do you? And
I haven't seen any poll that is convincing for me that he didn't get more than 50%. Clearly, there are some very questionable results. The 99+% in Chechnya, the National Republic. There've been a breakaway republic, and there were some other polls like that. But there were two issues. Number one, despite all of the really remarkable protests that happened, the protests were largely contained in cities among the middle class. And the opposition was terribly divided. It was terribly divided because it never had an opportunity to come together, so that's not surprising. But I think, in all probability, he probably did get more than the 50% mandate he needed to win. And the 62, 63% he got wasn't too greedy. It wasn't a kind of classic Soviet-style election. So I think when you compare it to other Russian elections, it was probably a little bit closer to being open.
So shades of gray, it is an improvement, is what you...
Shades of gray, it is an improvement.
The League of Voters, you saw this, an insult to civil society, is in some charges, counter-charges that this is political, anti-Putin politics. In the bottom line, you just said he won legitimately, but... Do you think
he still has the need? He's not secure enough.
Go through the? Yeah, that's the point.
He's not secure enough to accept the fact that maybe he only won with 51% of the vote. And this goes back to the tears and the acceptance speech. He personally and the current Russian regime acts as if they're scared, and they've done that for a number of years. And sitting from the outside, it's a little bit difficult to understand exactly what they're so scared of. But clearly, the manipulation of the elections, and not just the presidential elections, but more scandalous were the manipulation of the parliamentary elections, the hitting back at the opponents, a kind of thrashing about. It all has looked for quite some time like a regime that isn't confident it really controls its country.
Is that some sort of paranoid leftovers from the old Soviet days, or do they have some real concerns, real reasons to be insecure?
Well, there are real reasons for insecurity if we're talking about the Caucasus region to the south. The North Caucasus, which are in the Russian Republic, they've had continuing serious levels of violence there. So there are serious issues, but nothing on the scale that would seem to suggest a kind of instability that the regime seems to be scared of. They're clearly really paranoid about some sort of colored revolution seeping in. I think some of the anti-Americanism was for show, but they seem to really think that Hillary Clinton can demand demonstrations and that they just happen. And it doesn't look reasonable and rational from the outside. Now, that doesn't mean there's not some information we don't know about.
And what is the main message of protesters? What are they protesting?
They want fair elections. These are the folks who actually run the country. They run the institutions. Over the past 20 years in their own lives, they've come to accept more responsibility for what goes on, and they want to be consulted. The turning point was clearly in late September when Putin and President Medvedev, then Prime Minister Putin, came out and said, well, we're going to switch places, as if it was a done deal. And that just offended people. On the other hand, it's important to remember that the people who are protesting are all, in many ways, the children of Putin. They're the beneficiaries of the regime that Putin has created.
So you mentioned the parliamentary elections. Tell us what you can about those.
Well, the parliamentary elections, I think, were far more scandalous. And this was in the fall, and Putin's party, United Russia, carried the day. But clearly, there were lots of violations of election laws. And of course, there are two.
And this was to make sure that Mr. Putin's allies
control
the
parliament,
essentially.
Right. But what's important to remember is that there are really two issues when we talk about false elections. One is what happens on election day, and quite frankly, as we just saw, that can be more or less straightforward. But the real scandal of Russian elections is how the opposition is systematically denied the opportunity to put forward a serious run well before the election ever takes place.
What is the rationale for that control of whose name gets on the ballot?
Well, the rationale is this is a regime that covets control. And
so not really rationale, it's just brute strength.
It's brute, we can do it. And again, it goes back to this seeming disbelief in their own legitimacy. And that's where the biggest problem is moving forward, because any number of Russia observers inside the country and out can think of a number of things Putin can do to open up the political system. But if he and the people around him are really motivated by fear of their own people, that's not going to happen.
In the immediate aftermath, I'll oversimplify for the sake of asking the question, in that you saw two sort of camps on how to react in the international community. One saying react harshly and call a fraud and suggest that this was not a legitimate election, and then call into question Vladimir Putin's legitimacy as the leader of the country. The other is, wait a second, we have this growing middle class you referenced, people who are running the country, as you put it, and that they need to be engaged positively. You got to look at the long term and not punish them for any crimes of the current regime. What do you think of that argument?
Well, I think there's another factor which is very, very important, which is we, the United States, and we, the West, need Russian cooperation on any number of international issues, on energy, on Syria, on Iran, and to stand up and poke our finger in Putin's eye runs the risk of disrupting the northern supply route, which goes from Latvia through Russia to Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, any number of issues. And therefore, I think what we're going to see is on the one hand a quiet response, and on the other hand a lot of behind-the-scenes anger, certainly here in Washington, because of the anti-American nature of the campaign.
Well, exactly. The rules of engagement you just described for the West looking toward Moscow are very different than the campaign rhetoric we heard from Mr. Putin during the campaign. You would think it was back to the days of the Cold War. The things you mentioned about Hillary Clinton.
I mean, the rhetoric goes back before the Cold War. This really was.
Is that selling in Russia still? Is there a big group of Russians who still respond to that?
There clearly are some Russians who respond to it. It wasn't selling among the demonstrators. It wasn't selling in many parts of Russian society, but clearly it still resonates someplace. But the more troubling aspect of this for the relationship is that the Russian authorities seem to think it was all right. And the viewers not speaking Russian really need to understand it was scurrilous and disgusting, the kinds of attacks that were being made on our officials and on American society. It's not run-of-the-mill kind of European intellectual, well, you know, you Americans are a bunch of cowboys. This was really nasty stuff that set the clock back to the 1950s.
And so President Obama's reset with Russia and with Putin, what does this do to that? Well,
I think the reset policy is in tatters at the moment. One of the main architects of the policy, Ambassador Mike McFaul, became the subject of scurrilous attacks on himself, and the comments by Russian officials about Hillary Clinton go way over the edge of appropriate language and official discourse. So it's kind of hard to see how the reset button really got pushed.
What's next for democratic reforms in Russia looking forward? What are the signposts, as this election was one, that we can look at to see how things are progressing?
Well, there will not be any new elections. I think that's clear. I think we can see they're talking about direct elections of governors. Will those be real elections? Will they be contested? Will there be reform of the laws on parties? Will there be the political space that's granted for opposition groups to emerge? What's going to happen with social media? Will there be attempts to control it? I think these are all important issues. Another issue to watch is if the second set of convictions of the oligarch Khodorkovsky are thrown out, then Khodorkovsky is eligible to come out of prison. Will there be any? That would be an enormous signal if that were to happen. So there are lots of things to look forward to, but the nature of the campaign suggests we're in for a very long, hard slog.
What about the X factor of young people? We had one of them here yesterday, Mr. Kozlovsky, talking about youth movements in Russia for democratic reform.
Well,
is this an X factor that can make a difference?
It is an X factor, but it probably hasn't reached a tipping point yet. But certainly it'll be a major factor in whatever happens in efforts to control the internet. Mm-hmm. Facebook was made for Russians. It's a relationship society, and Russians have taken to Facebook even more than Americans have. So it really is, what kind of life will people like Mr. Kozlovsky live, and how much are they willing to fight for it? But those are the animating forces for change.
Does the arc of history favor democratic reforms in Russia? Are you optimistic?
The arc of history in Russia is a zig and a zag, mm-hmm. and we've seen these moments before in Russia, and Russia doesn't seem to be able to develop a statecraft suitable for the modern world, and for the last 200 years. Eventually, at some point, it will break out of the cycle, but one has to be very sober-minded about the possibilities.
Well, thank you, Blair, for sharing your insights, and we'll look forward to catching up with you as things develop. The long slog continues.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back soon with our next guest to talk about elections in Iran. Welcome back to the second part of our discussion. Joining us for a recap of the election in Iran, our guest is Haleh Esfandiari. Haleh is director of the Wilson Center's Middle East program. In 2007, she was held as a political prisoner in Iran. She later wrote a book about her experience, My Prison, My Home, One Woman's Story of Captivity in Iran. And Haleh, welcome back to Dialogue.
Thank you.
Now, let me ask you about the choices on the ballot in Iran. You've made the point in discussions off the air that it was a choice between conservatives. It wasn't as if it was a liberal versus a conservative or a progressive. This would almost be like in the United States, if we were to make the analogy, a Republican primary, where your only choices were on the conservative side of the slate.
Or a Democratic primary.
Or a Democratic primary, whatever the case may be.
More or less this was the case because after the 2009 presidential elections and the demonstrations in the street, and the government decided that this is not going to happen ever again. So the best way to deal with it was to arrest the leadership of the reformist movement and give them long-term sentences. And the two leaders, Karoubi and Mousavi, are under house arrest. So as a reaction to that, a lot of reformist voters decided not to come out and vote. And a handful of reformists were candidates, and two of the main reformist candidates who didn't even get elected. The reason was not that, in their case, the votes were rigged, because there were not reformists who came out and voted for them. So what was left was the conservatives, but among them there were several groups.
Now, one group backing President Ahmadinejad, or aligned with Ahmadinejad, yes. How did they do?
They have not fared as well as the president and the people around him expected, because President Ahmadinejad spent all of his first term and the last 3 years of his second term traveling to the provinces and showing his largesse and spending a lot of money in the provinces. I think the expectation was that the people of those provinces, people in small town, will vote for his candidates. I mean, the majority of the people, as far as we know, who made it, in the small towns are independent. But, because local elections in the provinces are local, mm-hmm. and are local issues. But then we don't know how these new parliamentarians are going to vote, because at the end of the day, they need the money from the government in order to spend it in their constituency. So they might decide to vote for the next year with the Ahmadinejad group in Parliament.
How much can we discern whether it's a situation where Ahmadinejad is losing popularity, or it's just that he's a lame duck, and so that people are moving on, trying to align themselves with the potential next president?
It's both. I think the supreme leader has been gradually withdrawing his support from the president. And you know how politics is. When you don't have a patron anymore, people turn their back to you. So I believe, because the supreme leader has been trying to undermine Ahmadinejad, he has lost a lot of his appeal among the people. But having said that, I don't think that the supreme leader will acquiesce to an impeachment of the president. They don't like to set these precedents in Iran.
Removing someone from power because they could be next.
Exactly. It happened once in the history of the Islamic Republic, but they don't like it. Until before the election, every time there was a talk of a possibility of impeaching President Ahmadinejad, the supreme leader apparently sent a message and said no.
Are there still individuals or factions that would like to see that happen, that have suggested they would like to see impeachment proceedings?
Oh, sure. There is President Ahmadinejad has been summoned to Parliament on Wednesday. He's going to appear in front of Parliament, and there are those deputies who have threatened that if he does not answer the questions that Parliament is going to put to him, and if parliamentarians are not satisfied with his answers, then there is always the possibility of starting the process of impeachment.
Is it likely that Ahmadinejad's successor, the next president of Iran, was someone who won during these parliamentary elections?
Well, the rumor, the rumor is that the current foreign minister, Mr. Salehi, is going to be the next president of Iran. So a year away, the presidential elections are in June 2013. So people are starting talking about Mr. Salehi. He's a very respected individual. He's very savvy in foreign policy. He's quite savvy on the nuclear issue. So it would be an ideal president to deal with the rest of the world and give a more, I would say, respectable and acceptable image of
not the
Iran.
loose cannon that Ahmadinejad has turned
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. He's a very serious person. He just very thoughtful, thinks what he says. I mean, he has to defend the Iranian foreign policy, whatever that is. Currently, as foreign minister, he may deep down in his heart agree or disagree with some of it, but he reflects the wishes of the Supreme Leader, and the Supreme Leader is very comfortable with it.
Is this a situation where essentially the Supreme Leader makes his choice known, and so within those power circles it's known who he would like to see emerge as the next president?
Not really, because
more subtle than that?
No, because when Khatami ran, the presidential elections were between Khatami and the then Speaker of Parliament, Natiq Nouri, and the Supreme Leader had made it clear that his preference was the Speaker of Parliament, Natiq Nouri, but the majority of the people voted for Khatami. No. It all depends who the other person is who is going to run against Salehi. But Salehi is someone who is accepted almost by all sides.
Now, one of the other things you mentioned that early on, the Supreme Leader's interest in having things go smoothly this time around. Along with that, he was urging significant turnout. It was a get the vote out effort to make this a legitimate election. How did they achieve, or how did they do in that regard? Did they get the type of turnout they were looking for?
He wanted really a high turnout, but I don't think they got the high turnout they wanted. And what one hears, and again this is speculation, that the elections were engineered and the votes were inflated. Mm-hmm. So, and usually the Supreme Leader comes out immediately after the vote, congratulates the people of Iran for taking part in the election. This time the elections were Friday, March 2nd, and he came out today, almost, a week. Yeah. So,
and so that says to you that he wasn't completely happy with the way things proceeded?
This means that he was hoping that there would be a larger turnout, but then he decided that he has to put the best possible face to the current turnout.
Where does the power lie in Iran? People look at elections and maybe get this expectation that new people in office can change the power structure in ways that could change the equation on something like the Iran nuclear program. Is that a stretch in this regard?
The Supreme Leader is the ultimate decision maker on certain issues, including the nuclear issue. But the decision on the nuclear programs, whether to negotiate with the West or not, whether to continue enriching uranium or not, it's all decided in the National Supreme Council. The President is a member of the National Supreme Council. The Supreme Leader has representatives there. There are commanders of the Revolutionary Guard. So it's really the National Supreme Council gets to a consensus, and they take the consensus to the Supreme Leader. Then he decides whether to go along with it or not. But nothing happens when it comes to foreign policy issues, when it comes to the nuclear issue, without the acquiescence and the knowledge of the Supreme Leader. And now that Iran has announced that they will negotiate with the P5+1, once again, it's sure that it is with a tacit agreement of the Supreme Leader.
And the Supreme Leader is this week had some positive things to say about President Obama. Do you see this as a negotiating, an olive branch, perhaps, that this was a signal that Iran is ready to do business?
Oh, sure. I think it was unbelievable that the first time that the Supreme Leader had something nice to say about the President of the United States, and he somehow acknowledged that the President talked about not having war. So that was an important sign. Talking to the P5+1 was another sign, allowing the IAEA inspectors to go and see one of the military nuclear sites, Parchin. Until now, they had not allowed the IAEA people to go there. Whether they are now cleaning that place, I don't know. But at least they have invited them to visit. So these are all important signs.
What do you think's happening here? Is it that sanctions are working, or is it the threat of a military strike, or was this the plan all along to put themselves in a position to deal? What do you think is happening?
The sanctions are working, and they are biting, and I think there is probably pressure from the, I would say, from the bazaar, from the economic sector in Iran, traders, businessmen, that this can't go on. It is harming the country. And there comes a stage where no matter how much we try and bypass the sanctions, at the end of the day we are suffering. Banks are not opening letters of credit, we can't get our money, we can't transfer money, all these things. So that is one reason for it. Of course, the military threat is another reason. I mean, look, my read of Iran has been all these years that Iran is not suicidal. And they know that regardless of whether they have a plan to retaliate or not, but it is going to create havoc in the country if you have a military strike.
Well, let's hope for a peaceful resolution.
I hope so, too.
Haleh, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you as well. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.